the order came down the line: retreat. Exhausted, bloodied American soldiers scrambled for the edge of the cliff, sliding down ropes, clawing their way to safety. Behind them, the Japanese swarmed across the plateau, screaming, shooting, bayoneting the wounded who could not flee. But one man stayed. He was a medic. He was unarmed, and he was a conscientious objector who had been called a coward by his own comrades just weeks before. Now, as 250 men retreated and the enemy closed in, Private First Class Desmond Doss stood alone atop Hacksaw Ridge and began to pray, Singhal, "Lord, please help me get one more." The date was May 5, 1945. The place was the Maeda Escarpment on Okinawa, a 400-foot vertical cliff that the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge. Above it, the Japanese 32nd Army had spent months tunneling into the coral, creating a fortress of caves and interconnected fighting positions. Below it, the 77th Infantry Division had been dying for days, trying to crack the linchpin of Japan's last defensive line. What happened on that ridge would become one of the most extraordinary stories of courage in the history of the United States Army. The tale of a man who saved 75 lives without ever firing a shot. Desmond Thomas Doss was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, on February 7, 1919. He was raised as a devout Seventh-day Adventist, a faith that emphasized the sanctity of the Sabbath and the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." His childhood was marked by two defining experiences. The first was a near-fatal incident with his brother, a childhood fight that ended with Desmond holding a brick, realizing with horror how close he had come to killing his own flesh and blood. From that moment, he swore never to take a life. The second was his father's alcoholism. William Doss, a World War I veteran, suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He wore a mask of poison gas in the trenches of France and never recovered. Young Desmond watched his father struggle with nightmares, depression, and rage. He saw what war did to men. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Doss faced an impossible choice. He wanted to serve his country. He believed in the cause, but he could not bring himself to kill. He registered as a conscientious objector, specifically, a conscientious cooperator, willing to serve in any capacity that did not require bearing arms. He enlisted as a medic, believing he could save lives instead of taking them. The Army did not know what to do with him. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Doss was assigned to the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. From the moment he arrived, he was marked as different. He refused to train on Saturdays, his Sabbath. He refused to handle a rifle. He knelt by his bunk each night to pray, earning the ridicule of men who saw prayer as weakness. His fellow soldiers called him every name imaginable. They threw boots at him. They called him a coward. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged on psychiatric grounds. Surely, they reasoned, any man who refused to fight must be mentally unfit. Doss endured it all with a quiet dignity that infuriated his tormentors even more. He did not fight back. He did not complain. He simply continued to do his job, learning the skills of a combat medic with a dedication that even his critics could not deny. One officer, Captain Jack Glover, told him directly, "Doss, when you're in combat, the first thing you're going to do is drop your medical bag and run. You're going to be a liability to this company." Doss replied quietly, "Captain, I won't run." The 77th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific in 1944. They fought on Guam and Leyte, where Doss proved himself under fire for the first time. He crawled through enemy lines to reach wounded men. He exposed himself to Japanese fire to drag casualties to safety. He earned a Bronze Star for valor before ever reaching Okinawa. But even as his fellow soldiers began to respect him, some even came to trust him, the question lingered. What would happen when the real test came? What would happen when the bullets were flying, and the only thing that mattered was survival? That test would come on a 40-foot cliff overlooking the East China Sea. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. It was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. 1,300 ships, 50 British vessels, and 180,000 American troops from the 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. The initial landings on the Hagushi beaches were eerily quiet. The Japanese, under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, had chosen not to fight on the shore. Instead, they withdrew to the southern third of the island, into a labyrinth of tunnels, caves, and fortified ridges that would make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. The 77th Infantry Division entered the line in late April, relieving the battered 96th Infantry Division, which had been fighting for weeks against the Shuri defensive line. Their objective: the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot coral ridge that dominated the approaches to Shuri Castle. The escarpment was not a ridge in the conventional sense. It was a vertical wall, a sheer cliff face that rose 40 feet from the surrounding terrain, then sloped upward to a broad, jagged plateau, honeycombed with Japanese defenses. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge, because of the way it tore through their ranks. To reach the top, soldiers had to climb cargo nets and rope ladders while under fire. Once they reached the summit, they found a killing ground, a narrow shelf of bare rock, where Japanese machine guns and mortars had every approach registered and zeroed. The 307th Infantry Regiment's 1st Battalion drew the assignment. B Company, Desmond Doss's unit, would be among the first to scale the cliff. The first assault went in on April 26th. Doss climbed with his company, carrying no weapon, only his medical kit, his Bible, and his faith. The moment they reached the top, the Japanese opened fire. Mortar rounds rained down. Machine guns swept the plateau. Men fell screaming. Doss went to work. He dragged wounded soldiers to the edge of the cliff, where ropes had been rigged to lower them to safety. He treated gaping wounds, applied tourniquets, injected morphine. He moved constantly, exposed constantly, his thin frame silhouetted against the smoke and flame. For days, the pattern repeated. The Americans would attack at dawn, seize a portion of the ridge, and dig in. The Japanese would counterattack at night, infiltrating through caves and tunnels, killing silently with knives and bayonets. By morning, the lines would have shifted again, and the medics would crawl out to recover the dead and wounded. Doss never stopped. He worked through the nights, through the counterattacks, through the shelling that turned the coral into razor-sharp shrapnel. He treated Japanese wounded as well as American, a practice that horrified some of his comrades, but one he insisted upon as a matter of faith. On April 29th, Doss performed an act of heroism that would later be cited in his Medal of Honor citation. A patrol from B Company had advanced 200 yards beyond the American lines when it was ambushed. Men went down in the open, exposed to enemy fire from 3 sides. Doss, without hesitation, moved forward alone, crawling through a hail of rifle and mortar fire to reach the wounded. He found a soldier with a sucking chest wound, barely breathing. Doss dragged him to a shallow depression, treated the wound, and waited for darkness. When night fell, he carried the man back across 200 yards of no man's land, crawling the entire distance with the wounded soldier on his back. He went back. He brought out another, and another. By May 4th, the battalion had been on the ridge for 9 days. Casualties were staggering. Rifle companies that had started with 200 men were down to platoon strength. The men were exhausted, frostbitten from the cold nights, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. But they held. On the night of May 4th, the Japanese launched a massive counterattack. They came screaming out of their caves, waving swords and bayonets, determined to throw the Americans off the ridge. The fighting was hand-to-hand rifle butts, knives, fists. Men died in the dark, their faces inches from their killers. Doss was in the midst of it, treating the wounded as they fell. A grenade landed in a shell hole where he was working with several wounded men. Without hesitation, Doss placed both feet on the grenade and stood on it. He later described what happened. "I stood on it, and it blew me into the air. The only thing that saved me was my thick-soled boots." The explosion hurled him into the air, shrapnel tore through his legs, but the men in the hole survived. Doss bandaged his own wounds and continued working. By dawn on May 5th, the battalion had reached its breaking point. The Japanese had been reinforced during the night. Fresh troops from the 62nd Division had moved into the caves, ready to continue the fight. The American positions were untenable, exposed, undersupplied, and held by men who had not slept in days. The order came from battalion headquarters: withdraw. The survivors began to fall back toward the cliff. They moved in rushes, firing as they went, carrying their wounded when they could. The Japanese pressed hard, sensing victory. Doss reached the edge of the cliff. Below him, the survivors of his company were descending the ropes, sliding down the 40-foot face to the relative safety of the base. Above him, the Japanese were advancing wave after wave of infantry, their officers waving swords, their enlisted men screaming, "Banzai!" And scattered across the plateau, lying in shell holes and behind rocks, were the wounded. Dozens of them. Men who could not move. Men who would be killed or captured within minutes if someone did not reach them. Doss looked at the cliff. He looked at the wounded. He looked at his empty hands, the hands of a medic, a conscientious objector, a man who had been called a coward. He made his choice. He turned his back on the cliff and walked toward the enemy. The plateau was a vision of hell. Smoke from burning vegetation mixed with the dust of mortar impacts, creating a thick haze that limited visibility to a few dozen yards. The crack of rifle fire was continuous, punctuated by the deeper thump of grenades and the scream of wounded men. The coral underfoot, shattered by days of shelling, was as sharp as broken glass. Doss moved through this landscape alone. He had no weapon, no cover, no supporting fire. He had only his medical kit, his faith, and a single rope that he had rigged with a bowling knot, the kind he had learned as a boy in the hills of Virginia. The first wounded man he found was a sergeant from a company, hit in both legs by machine gun fire. He was lying in the open 50 yards from the cliff, bleeding out. Doss crawled to him. The Japanese saw him moving. Rifle rounds snapped past his head, striking the coral and sending up puffs of white dust. A machine gun traversed toward his position, its rounds walking closer with each burst. Doss reached the sergeant. He applied tourniquets to both legs, injected morphine and began to drag him toward the cliff. It took 15 minutes to cover 50 yards. Doss pulled the man by his harness, crawling backward, using his own body to shield the wounded soldier from incoming fire. The machine gun never stopped. The rifle rounds never stopped, but Doss never stopped moving. At the cliff edge, he tied his rope around the sergeant's body and began to lower him. The rope burned through his hands, stripping skin, leaving bloody grooves in his palms. He did not let go. When the sergeant reached the bottom, hands reached out to pull him to safety. Doss hauled the rope back up and went looking for the next man. For hour after hour, the pattern repeated. Doss would crawl out onto the plateau, find a wounded man, treat his wounds, drag him to the cliff, and lower him to safety. Then he would go back, and back, and back. The Japanese knew what he was doing. They could see him, a lone figure in a blood-stained uniform, moving deliberately across the killing ground. They fired at him constantly. They sent patrols to hunt him. They threw grenades in his direction. Nothing stopped him. Private First Class Fred Brooks, one of the wounded men Doss rescued, later described the experience. "I was lying there, shot through both legs, and I knew the Japanese were coming. I could hear them yelling. I thought I was dead. Then this little guy appears out of the smoke, Doss, the medic we all made fun of. He says, 'Don't worry, soldier, I'll get you out of here.' And he did. He dragged me 200 yards with bullets hitting all around us. I owe him my life." At one point, Doss encountered a soldier who was beyond help, a young private with a massive head wound, his breathing shallow and irregular. Doss knelt beside him, opened his Bible, and read the 23rd Psalm. The man died as Doss prayed. Doss closed his eyes. He whispered, "Lord, help me find one more." Then he went back into the fire. The Japanese were growing desperate. They could not understand this man. He was unarmed, yet he would not stop. He was alone, yet he seemed to be everywhere. They sent a squad to cut him off from the cliff to surround him and kill him before he could reach the edge. Doss saw them coming. He grabbed the nearest wounded man, a soldier with a shattered arm, and began to drag him toward a different section of the cliff, away from the approaching Japanese. The squad pursued, firing as they ran. Doss reached the edge. He tied the rope. He lowered the man. Then he realized he was trapped. The Japanese squad was 50 yards away, spreading out to cut off his escape. There was no way back to the main descent point. There was no cover. There was only the cliff and the enemy. Doss did not hesitate. He grabbed the rope and slid over the edge, not descending carefully, but dropping, sliding, falling the last 10 feet to land in a heap at the bottom. The rope burned through his hands, through his uniform, through the flesh itself. He landed among a group of soldiers who stared at him in disbelief. One of them, a lieutenant, later wrote, "He came over that cliff like a ghost. His hands were shredded. His uniform was torn to pieces. He was covered in blood, his own and other men's, and the first thing he said was, 'I need to go back up. There are more.'" The lieutenant ordered Doss to stay put. He was wounded. He had been on the ridge for 12 hours. He had already saved more men than anyone could count. Doss refused. He said, "Give me your canteen. I'm going back." The lieutenant tried to stop him. Doss pushed past him and began to climb. On the plateau, the situation had grown even worse. The Japanese had reached the main descent point and were firing down on the American positions below. Wounded men, who had been waiting for evacuation, were now in immediate danger of being captured or killed. Doss climbed back onto the ridge and went to work. He found a soldier with a stomach wound, one of the worst injuries a medic can face. The man was conscious, in agony, begging for water. Doss gave him sips from the canteen, treated the wound, and began the long drag to the cliff. The Japanese spotted him again. A sniper took aim from a cave 200 yards away. The first round struck the coral inches from Doss's head. The second hit the wounded soldier in the shoulder, a second wound compounding the horror. Doss covered the man with his own body and waited. The sniper fired again. The round passed through Doss's uniform, grazing his side, leaving a burn mark on his skin. It did not penetrate. Doss began to move again, dragging the wounded man, crawling, pulling, refusing to stop. By late afternoon, Doss had been on the ridge for nearly 12 hours. His hands were raw meat. His uniform was in tatters. He had been hit by shrapnel, grazed by bullets, and nearly blown up by grenades. He had not eaten. He had not rested. He had not stopped praying. And still he went back. Every time he reached the bottom of the cliff, he turned around and climbed again. Every time someone tried to stop him, he pushed past. Every time he lowered another wounded man, he whispered the same prayer, "Lord, please help me find one more." The count grew. 10 men, 20, 30. The soldiers at the bottom of the cliff began to realize what was happening. They looked up and saw that lone figure at the top, silhouetted against the smoke, lowering another stretcher, then disappearing back into the fire. Men who had mocked him weeks before now wept at the sight. Captain Jack Glover, the same officer who had predicted Doss would run, watched in disbelief. He later said, "I was wrong about him. I was so wrong. He was the bravest man I ever saw." By nightfall, Doss had lowered 75 wounded men to safety. 75, one man, 12 hours, no weapon. He had saved the equivalent of an entire rifle company, almost 4 platoons of American soldiers who would have died on that ridge if not for his courage. The official count would later be adjusted. Doss himself insisted it was closer to 50, though eyewitnesses maintained it was 75 or more. The exact number does not matter. What matters is what he did. On May 21, 1945, Desmond Doss was wounded for the third time. During a night attack on a ridge near Shuri, a Japanese grenade exploded at his feet, showering his legs with shrapnel. He waited 5 hours for litter bearers to reach him. 5 hours, lying in the dark, treating his own wounds while enemy patrols moved through the area. When the litter bearers finally arrived and began carrying him to safety, they came under tank attack. Doss saw another soldier who was more critically wounded. He crawled off the stretcher and ordered the bearers to take the other man first. While waiting for their return, he was shot again, this time suffering a compound fracture of his left arm. With magnificent fortitude, Doss bound a rifle stock to his shattered arm as a splint, and then crawled 300 yards over rough terrain to the aid station. He crawled 300 yards with a broken arm, through enemy fire. He survived. He would live another 61 years. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military award. Truman shook his hand and said, "I'm proud of you. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss's citation reads, "In part, through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, PFC Doss saved the lives of many soldiers. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty." The war ended 3 months before Doss received his medal. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some historians believe the bloody battle for Okinawa, with its 12,000 American dead, 100,000 Japanese dead, and 150,000 civilian casualties, helped convince Allied leaders that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be too costly to contemplate. Desmond Doss returned home to Virginia. He spent 5 years recovering from his wounds, tuberculosis, lost lung function, the lingering effects of 17 pieces of shrapnel still embedded in his body. He raised a family. He spoke occasionally of his experiences, but never sought attention. He died on March 23, 26, at the age of 87. At the top of Hacksaw Ridge, where the coral cliffs overlook the East China Sea, there is a small informational panel. It is written in both Japanese and English. It tells the story of a battle that cost thousands of lives on both sides, and it tells the story of one man, a medic, a conscientious objector, a man of faith who climbed that cliff and refused to leave until every wounded soldier was safe. His name was Desmond Doss. He never fired a shot, he never killed an enemy soldier, and yet, on the bloodiest ridge in the Pacific, he became one of the greatest heroes the United States Army has ever produced. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War.